Influencing popular culture, politics, and everything in between. The local station takes you ringside as we discuss the crazy world that is professional wrestling. This is Going Ringside with the local station.
Hello there, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Going Ringside. I'm your host, Scott Johnson. Today, somewhat of a sad episode. We are discussing the final days and the death of Miss Elizabeth, one of the most iconic figures in the history of pro wrestling. Before we move forward on that, I want to encourage you to go back to last week's episode with legendary star Thunderbolt Patterson and his push for civil rights in pro wrestling, a story that is very, very seldom been told. You want to check it out, last week's show. But today, we're talking about this story and Elizabeth Hulette, who she was and how she died. Because I've talked to a lot of wrestling fans when I bring up Elizabeth and the end of her life in 2003, a lot of people kind of half remember what had happened. And so we kind of wanted to set the straight what did happen tragically in 2003 when still young Elizabeth Hulette did pass away. She was in the presence of Lex Luger at the time, and he took some backlash because he was there, but was never charged with any sort of crime. We'll talk about that too. We are going to be joined a little later today by a veteran homicide detective who is now retired and will join us to help break down this case and what went on when police arrived at this home. And also friend of the show, Desiree Josen with the Chutes and Ladders podcast. She's going to help us analyze the wrestling, both how Lex Luger dealt with this as a wrestling figure, and then Elizabeth and just kind of her iconic career. And let's talk a little about that. Miss Elizabeth, by far, is best known for her time with Macho Man Randy Savage in the 80s and his rise to fame. She was his real-life wife. That was not described at the time. She was his valet, his manager at the time. And Elizabeth stood out like no one else in the WWF at the time. Look at her. She looks like a real-life princess. She was kind and gentle, soft-spoken, the total opposite of everything around her in the World Wrestling Federation, and the total opposite of Macho Man Randy Savage. You can go look, and there's been a lot of discussion of what their relationship was like, difficulties and struggles, as many married couples do, but obviously this one is exacerbated by the celebrity, the life of pro wrestling in the 1980s, just a very difficult lifestyle that is not easy on a lot of people. But it cannot be overstated how over Elizabeth was as a female figure in pro wrestling, because back then, they didn't really exist that much. I mean, you had like the Fabulous Moolah, you had Wendy Richter, maybe Sherry Martel eventually came in and, took Randy in storyline away from Liz. But as far as just a beauty queen, a kind, almost a princess-like figure in pro wrestling, no one has ever been as popular as Miss Elizabeth. I mean, look today when you think of everyone from Bianca Belair and Charlotte Flair to Stephanie McMahon and Trish Stratus, no one was as over as Elizabeth. You really need to go back and put yourself in the time to know what that was like. I mean, when the mega powers exploded and tens of millions of people watched that, she was at the middle of that. When Macho was at his biggest, when Hulk was at his biggest, Elizabeth was there. And when Elizabeth, if you look at the Dark Side of the Ring episode on the life of Macho Man and Elizabeth, they talk a lot about that. I'll cite that a few times here in the show. Life was obviously not easy, and eventually Elizabeth stepped away for a while. But when she came back and rescued Randy in a match and kind of turned him good again, and he proposed to her, Bruce Pritchard, in that special, he says, even the men were tearing up, we knew we did it good. We had them hooked. Kayfabe was still very much alive at this point in WWF. People believed it was real. And to them, and there was reality here because Randy and Liz were a couple. They were actually married in real life. It wasn't known on camera though, but you could kind of tell they were a couple back in the day. The fans ate it up. They could not have loved this more. And then they got married in the ring. SummerSlam 91. One of the most beautiful moments in a industry where you don't see stuff like this. The fans could not have loved this more. Elizabeth could not have been more popular. So she was as beloved in this industry as it gets. Sadly, life happens. Her and Randy's marriage ends. She gets into other relationships and eventually moves to WCW. The industry at this point in the mid-90s is changing. It's becoming more teenage and adult-oriented. Liz tries to keep up, but honestly, I don't know that it ever worked for her. We still wanted the Disney princess, which is what she was. To see her try and, be more exotic on camera, it was kind of jarring because people had grown up knowing Elizabeth with Randy. But during this time on the personal side, you hear all the accounts, Elizabeth problems kind of started arising. Hulk Hogan's ex-wife talked about it a lot in the Dark Side of the Ring documentary. And problems started arising, and eventually, by many accounts, she started a relationship with Lex Luger, who is now in WCW. Eric Bischoff had brought him back to the company, and Lex and Liz started down the slow road of destruction with substance abuse issues. Substance abuse obviously has been an issue in pro wrestling for a long time, but there's an issue here. Think of the substance abuse a 300-pound man, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, can absorb into his body versus what Liz can, and that kind of plays a role in this story. Eventually, WCW folds by 2001. Lex Luger is not brought into WWF. I was just reading a New York Post article about that, where Lex essentially, he was still getting money from his WCW contract, but didn't have a job to go to. And that was when the pills took hold, according to the New York Post article. So as a result, Liz and Lex, now in a relationship, a lot happens. Struggles with, issues of pill use and just living that lifestyle and never quite got out of it. And sadly, in May of 2003, after police had already been called out on them in other instances before, and Lex had started to kind of have run-ins with the law, he calls 911 because Miss Elizabeth Hulette, was not waking up. Tragically, she lost her life in May of 2003. Still a young age, shocking the wrestling world because as far as a character, if you see any hardcore ECW guy and you heard they passed away or different types of wrestlers, but not Miss Elizabeth. She was like a porcelain doll. She was so pristine. To hear she had passed away was a tragedy for the wrestling community. And I want to show you what was found in her system. If you guys could put up on the screen, this is from the toxicology report that was done by the medical practitioners after her body was examined, and the toxicological analysis of blood for her. Meprobomat, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, carisoprodol, promethazine. So these are things like muscle relaxers, anxiety meds, then as people know of hydrocodone and alcohol. Cause of death, acute toxicity, multiple drugs. At the bottom, very important, manner of death, accident. And that was obviously a thing. You guys can come back on camera here. It was an accident because Lex Luger, while he was there, and many people had ill will toward him because of the lifestyle that they were leading, Lex Luger was never charged with a crime. Lex Luger was not arrested. Lex Luger did have other run-ins with the law and eventually turned his life around. He's become a born-again Christian and, had his health issues, which you probably heard about. I tried to get Lex on the show last year. He was not able to, he had to decline, but he was very kind in doing it. I thank that. But Lex, his life went downhill for quite a while after this, eventually kind of getting back on track. And if you've watched some of Diamond Dallas Page's stuff in the last few months, he's working with Lex to try and get him walking again. But it was an accident, according to law enforcement. And it was just a tragic one because Elizabeth, was a wonderful person by all accounts and just so beloved. But it was interesting when they started documenting this on the different news outlets or like Dark Side of the Ring, you start hearing about the dark side. And I want to put another quote on the screen. This is what Scott Hall, you remember Razor Ramon said on Dark Side of the Ring. Liz doesn't weigh 270 like me and Lex. Liz weighs about 85 pounds. So she's taking the same amount of pills that the 300-pounders are taking. If that's even remotely close to true, you can imagine what damage this did to Elizabeth Hulette's body. She was not designed to take in this much. And tragically, she lost her life at a young age in 2003. So I brought in Tom Hackney. Tom is a retired veteran homicide detective. He's dealt with a lot of overdoses over the years because I wanted to kind of ask him, what happened here? What did police do? I wanted to ask him about the decision why Lex Luger was not charged. As you know, he was not. So there was no criminal filings against him. I want to ask Tom about how detectives make that determination. And then, as I said, Desiree Joseph with the Chutes and Ladders podcast will join us right after that to talk about, kind of how this affected the wrestling world and how, Elizabeth's legacy. Talk a little more about that because she was a special figure in pro wrestling. So let's start out right now. Here's retired police detective down here in Florida. Here is Tom Hackney.
Now, to kind of break this down, we are joined by Tom Hackney. He's a retired veteran police detective here in Florida, where we're at, dealt with a lot of cases like these. Tom, welcome to the show today.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Happy to be here.
So I want to talk about this. This got a lot of headlines. What we know at this point, what it was described for Elizabeth Hulette is acute toxicity brought on, it sounds like it was a combination of vodka and painkillers. You've probably walked into a lot of cases like these where you have an overdose. What's it like? What were police dealing with when they walked into this scene?
Yeah, these get worked as kind of the undetermined death, and you have to look at these as to, first of all, is this a natural death? Is this something that somebody did? And then you start evaluating that scene, and you see the alcohol there, and you see some lifestyle things, and here, you look at who's involved too, and what that goes on. So it probably didn't take law enforcement very long to assess kind of what was going on with this. Again, lifestyle and the scene would really dictate what you're looking at, but they're hard cases.
I want to talk about the gentleman who was there with her, Larry Folds, better known to the public as Lex Luger, very high-profile celebrity. They obviously were close at the time of her death, and there was a lot of finger-pointing at him, but in the end, charges were never filed. I want to talk to you about how police would handle him there if, by nature, there may have been criminal activity going on with substance use in the home, but he's not charged. How did police get to that point?
Yeah, so, you have to factor in, and you can't ignore his notoriety. So when law enforcement gets there, they're I'm sure, instantly made aware of who he is and what he is. And so I don't like it necessarily that somebody of that stature gets a pass, if you want to call it that. But a lot of times that's kind of what happens. And especially in the past, a little, as you go back there, that's kind of like, hey, this is okay, if you will, when it's not. And these kind of cases are infamously hard to prove and tack on anyway. You go into these scenes and you see people dead, and you see the drugs at the scene, and a decision has to be made from law enforcement.
And I'm assuming they're super emotional.
Oh, without a doubt. And typically these things aren't intentional. So it's partying gone too far, and the next thing you know, something has happened. Somebody has done too much of this and mixed too much of that together. And of course there's emotions involved because there's no real intent. The intent was to party, and it just went, a little past the fun.
And on the decision whether or not that he should face charges, would that be an officer on the scene, or would they coordinate with the prosecutor in that jurisdiction? How would that go down? Yeah,
that would be a conversation between whoever the investigators are at the scene from that agency and the prosecuting authority there. And again, the cloud that sits over top of that is who he is and his notoriety. And
I want to get to that because this obviously becomes a public media spectacle.
Yeah, so you've got that too. And
so when that happens nationally, are police having conversations about that? They know that that's part of this.
Yeah, so that's, like it or not, media attention in certain cases is good because it draws attention when you're looking for a missing child or you're trying to solve a case. Is good when you have kind of an external force there that's weighing on you with the notoriety and what our agency would be looked at by the public. Those are external factors that absolutely play a part in a decision as to whether to arrest, whether to prosecute, whether, the prosecutors have that a moral obligation to make arrests in cases that they feel like they can successfully prosecute, and that's part of what they do. Law enforcement.
And I want to interrupt you. You said the phrase that I think is intriguing here: successfully prosecute. Mm-hmm. That's part of this. I mean, it's not a guarantee. You arrest someone and you're going to be able to prosecute them.
Right. So, from an investigator and a person who supervised investigators, you want to make sure that this is not about an arrest, that a case isn't just about getting somebody and making an arrest. Again, that external media pressure and public pressure could play a part in that, but it's not just the arrest. It's a successful prosecution. And, that all goes into it. Did law enforcement have the ability to build a case strong enough to get that successful prosecution? And from the prosecutor standpoint, do we want to move forward with a case that we feel like that either public sentiment would be sympathetic towards the defendant in the case, and that notoriety, that all plays a part, kind of gets mixed in the wash, and what comes out a lot of times is the fact that no arrest gets made.
And because of what's been reported, painkillers, vodka, mm-hmm. I mean, kind of what I'm reading is nothing inherently seems overly illegal that was in her system. It's an overdose. I mean, painkillers are legal. Yeah. Vodka is, of course, legal. So does that kind of make it a little more dicey as well?
It does. And, you have to look at, are these painkillers, are they something that were legally obtained and just overprescribed or overtaken? You can have painkillers prescribed for dental surgery or whatever. And, if you choose to take all of them at one time, mixed with some vodka, that kind of falls on you. And, is that his obligation to keep? And I want
to also ask, if police had been to the home before, were aware of them at all, does that figure in?
Oh, of course. And, that notoriety piece comes into play when law enforcement gets to the scene, and it's starstruck, maybe, who knows? If you happen to be a wrestling fan and you got called out there as a police officer to handle an issue, yeah, there's a human nature to it of, hey, this guy I know, I watch him on TV, I watch him wrestle, I knew this, we can sort this out some other way.
And last question, she was a small, petite woman. Lex Luger is a big, strong guy, of course. In your experience dealing with a lot of ODs that you probably have before, petite women are going to be more vulnerable. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just, body mass and body type. The smaller framed person is going to have to use less of anything. And, just metabolism wise, what it may take him to reach that level of ODing is certainly a whole lot more than it would take her with her little petite size. Maybe a few shots of vodka and a couple of these painkillers is enough to really push her over the edge. And it just, a lot of that depends on the body. And that comes back to what the police and prosecutors had to look at to make that decision. And it's in the past a little bit. Today we look at that a little bit different, certainly with suppliers and who with illegal substances. If there's a ton of cocaine that's in somebody's system, and those get looked at differently about how they got it and who supplied it. Here, we talked about the fact that these are legally obtained things. It's a tough case.
Well, Tom Hackney, retired police detective down here in Florida. Thank you for joining us, Tom.
All right, Scott. Thanks, buddy.
Well, now I want to take some time to talk a little about the wrestling impact of Miss Elizabeth's life and the tragedy that was the end of her life. And we brought in Desiree Josen with the Chutes and Ladders podcast. Desiree, where do people find the show?
You can find us with new episodes every Monday and Wednesday on Spotify and YouTube, and interact with us on Instagram and Facebook.
Before we get to the tragedy at the end of her life, let's talk a little about her legacy.
Yeah.
She really was the first lady of wrestling.
She was. I was a big fan, and my favorite wrestler is Macho Man Randy Savage, and they are synonymous. So
she was the fixture before women really were in wrestling. I mean, prior to that, you had Wendy Richter and the fabulous Moolah, but you didn't have that star beauty queen that the whole show was built around.
She brought some class and elegance to the madness.
Yeah, and she was totally opposite of Macho.
Yeah.
In every way.
Yeah, I feel like it was a great balance. And what was really cool was there weren't any female valets or managers. There was Bobby the Brain Heenan and Jimmy Hart, really.
So a lot of people talk about, oh, Raw got big ratings, SmackDown got big ratings, whatever. But when Elizabeth was in the middle of Hulk Hogan and Macho Man imploding, those got more viewers than I think anything we've ever seen in history.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I think a lot of fans modern forget that.
Yeah.
How many tens of millions of people watch that stuff.
The mega powers, it was huge.
I mean, she was a household name. I mean, as you have big names in women's wrestling now, but Elizabeth was just as well known as anyone.
And she still is to this day.
She still is to this day. So let's talk about the tragedy at the end of her life. So her and Macho divorce.
Yeah.
She does, I think, a lot of WCW stuff. And then afterwards, is my understanding, was in a relationship with Lex Luger. And it looks like life was kind of going downhill for both of them.
Yeah.
So it was a sad ending for her.
Yeah. And I feel like that's the thing, too, is Macho Man had a reputation of being so possessive and protective, and that was to protect her from that kind of environment once they divorced.
I never really looked at it that way.
Yeah.
We always view him as protective, but you have to consider the environment she was in.
Yeah, he was notorious for keeping her by his side and not letting her stray away because he knew what was going on in those locker rooms and after the shows. So
I heard, and I want to name the name, but there was Conrad Thompson. I once heard telling a story about a female, an attractive female in wrestling, and like I would never let her anywhere near there. It's like a Shark Tank in backstage. So it's interesting that when Macho was away, things went downhill. Now I don't know that they were perfect with Macho. It is what it is. I mean, life is what it is. But the death, there were a lot of fingers pointed to Lex Luger. Rightfully so, wrongly so, he's never charged with a crime.
Right.
Lex's life changed after that. Do you think the criticism, do you think he did take a hit in the industry in that time?
Absolutely, just because she's so loved and, she was like a doll to the wrestling industry, and then she gets involved with pills and alcohol, and, he was the main factor of where she was getting, I guess, those assets from, or at least in that environment. So he was, even though he wasn't directly part of it, he was indirectly involved.
Now, she passes away, and since then, I don't know if it had any role, but Lex's life has changed around dramatically.
Yeah.
He obviously has had the health issues, and I mean, I've seen Diamond Dallas Page posting the stuff about it walking again, which is great.
Huge.
But it looks like, despite the health setbacks, that was the catalyst that kind of changed Lex Luger's life. Or it appears that way to me.
Yeah, I feel like it may have just opened his eyes to living a healthier lifestyle.
Sure.
Who knows?
What do you think? Do you think fans in this era where she was the female in wrestling versus now where it's almost 50-50, do you think fans forget sometimes, who are in this younger generation, how much of an icon she was?
Yes. And that's the thing, is I grew up with her, so I idolize her, and along with Sensational Sherry, even though they were polar opposites.
Very opposite. And both have supported Macho.
Right. And, who could forget that WrestleMania 7 moment when they, reunited in the ring. But, I mean, compared to now, women's wrestling is completely different, and they're athletes.
And she always seemed so out of place. She was this nice, demure, wonderful person, delicate, around just Hulk Hogan and the Bushwhackers.
These monsters, yes. But she held her own, and I think that was really cool, was she was not physically in the ring, but played such a major role in storylines.
And when Macho proposed, and they had, I can't remember if it was a real-life wedding or a show wedding, they did the real life elsewhere. I don't remember.
Yeah.
But that was like ratings gold.
Oh, yeah. And then Jake the Snake at the reception.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. It's just television gold.
It was amazing.
Yeah, I think it is hard to understate how much of a mega star she was with the Mega Powers. I mean, they put her in the middle of that storyline for a reason.
Yeah, and she's the one that ran and grabbed Hulk Hogan in the back to save Macho from, who was it, Honky Tonk Man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And fans were just eating this up. More like the ratings back then versus we talk about ratings now compared to then. It's just hard to believe how many people watch that stuff.
And what's really cool, it's like a love story. It was a real one. And, you know, we were all invested as fans, and it was.
Now, later on, before we go, she did, you know, she divorces Macho, but was still a fixture on WCW. She was obviously with Flair for a while, and she tried to adapt to the new style. Did it work for her when she's wearing, you know, leather miniskirts and stuff? And did you think that worked for her as well as the kind of almost the Disney princess character?
It kind of threw me off because she was wearing those really nice, elegant gowns. And granted, the times were different, but when she joined even NWO and was wearing the sequins dress and, like you said, the leather, it was kind of odd to see her. She was like a bad girl, and I'm like, you're not a heel, Elizabeth.
You're just
no,
not.
you're a face. So it was crazy, but I get trying to evolve.
And lastly, on Lex, would you say his image has improved?
I think so.
I think it has.
You know, it'd be different if he wasn't taking accountability or anything, and he really is. So, and he's trying to be better. Can't blame him.
Well, Desiree Joseph, one more time, where people find the show.
You can find us on Instagram and Facebook, and new episodes Monday and Wednesday on Spotify and YouTube.
Thank you, Desiree.
Thank you.
So I appreciate Desiree and Tom both coming on to join us to break down just a sad ending to what was an amazing life. It was Elizabeth Hulette. So I appreciate you joining us for this episode. We're going to be a lot more positive in weeks to come, but wanted to cover this, what I think was an important story for people to know a little more about. So thanks for joining us on this episode of Going Ringside. We'll see you back here next time.
This has been Going Ringside with The Local Station, brought to you every Wednesday on your favorite podcast player, on New Sport Jacks Plus, as well as the New Sport Jacks YouTube channel.